President Hage Geingob recently signed the Financial Institutions and Markets, shortened FIM Act, into law. The objective of the Financial Institutions and Markets Act is to consolidate and harmonize legislation governing financial institutions, financial intermediaries, and financial markets in Namibia. Now, currently, supervision of non-banking financial institutions is undertaken through various standalone laws. Joining me on the line now is Mr. Kenneth Matomola, the CEO of NAMFISA. Good morning, sir, and thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on air.
You're very welcome, sir. Now let's get right into it. How does this legislation aim to address some of the shortcomings that are experienced in the non-banking and financial sector?
Just to put some context to the legislation that has come into place, there was some assessment that was done on the Namibia financial sector, which included the non-banking financial sector as well. Following those assessments, Namibia as a country, we embarked on the reforms to address the shortcomings that we identified. With respect to the non-banking financial sector, we embarked on the 3 areas of reforms, that is being the legislative, supervisory, and institutional reforms. Just to unpack this, the legislative reform is the one that culminated into the passing of the FIM Act. As you have said to the viewers, that this modernizes the pieces of legislation that are archaic, and in some cases they are inconsistent with the best practice in the financial regulation and supervision. So the FIM Act, together with the NAMFISA Act, addresses these shortcomings in the sector. When you look at the FIM Act, it is a principle-based law. It's more responsive to changes in the financial sector, because we know the financial sector is more evolving and it's a dynamic sector. Therefore, the law needs to keep pace with the happening in the financial sector. Therefore, the FIM embraces an integrated approach which is more consistent, and the provisions in this FIM eliminate some conflicting provisions that we have seen so far, and it eliminates some regulatory arbitrages, because some of the laws were passed at different times in time, and therefore they are inconsistent with each other, and they are sometimes create some arbitrages in terms of compliance. So these changes also in the FIM and the NAMFISA Act have enhanced the consumer protection and education provisions which were lacking in the current laws that are being applied. So in this way, we are addressing all the shortcomings that we identified. There are many of them, and so far we satisfy that these laws are better suited for Namibia.
Now, Mr. Matomola, an important provision in the new legislation is the plain language requirement. What does this entail?
When we speak about plain language, this is part of an important pillar in the financial law, which is consumer protection. Because we know consumer protection creates confidence in the financial system. As a result of that, then there will be financial sustainability, financial stability in the system. And to this end, the FIM advocates for plain language in respect to financial contracts that are entered into between the service providers and the consumers. So this means that the service providers should write their financial contracts. For example, the insurance contract should be written in the language that is not legalistic in nature. It should be a language that is understandable so that the consumers can make informed decisions. You are aware that the current contracts, that financial contracts, are very difficult to read by the consumers at this point in time. And therefore, in some cases, this may require the assistance of legal practitioners. But the FIM provides that let these contracts be written in such a way that the language used and the font sizes of the contracts should be conducive to the user, that the language is understandable, and they can be fully comprehended. So that is one important pillar of consumer protection.
So how does this act then empower NAMFISA as a supervisory body?
The act, the way it is structured, it's structured in such a way that it makes sure that there is separation of powers, whereby the Parliament is given or retains its powers of making laws, whereby it sets the overriding framework, which are, for example, fixed policies on issues that require certainty. However, the Minister of Finance is also given powers to issue regulations, because we know these financial system changes over time, and therefore certain things may come up, and the minister is empowered to issue some of those regulations in order to regulate some of the matters in the financial sector. And to operationalize the law, the authority is empowered to issue standards and directives. And these standards and directives are aimed at ensuring that malpractices in the financial sectors are addressed. And if there are new things that is coming up in the market, this can be addressed through these standards. And the standards need to be consistent with the overriding framework as set out by Parliament. Therefore, NAMFISA will not make any laws. NAMFISA will only operationalize the FIM. Any standard that will be issued by NAMFISA which is inconsistent with the FIM, that will be deemed to be against law, and therefore is null and void. Therefore, when we look at this, the FIM, it requires that NAMFISA should adopt a supervisory approach which can identify, monitor, and mitigate the risks in the financial sector. In this respect, we have been preparing ourselves to ensure that we move to risk-based supervision, because this is what is required by the new Act, other than relying on compliance-based, because the world has moved on from compliance to risk-based supervision. So the Act requires us to do so. Also, when you look at the FIM, you will see that as an example of the powers that has been given to NAMFISA, is that if some of the key persons that operate in the financial sector, say, for example, a director of a given regulated entity is found not to be fit and proper in the context of the law, the authority has the powers to direct the removal of the said person, that the institution may be able to replace that person with the required competence, skills that is required to operate in the financial sector. Also, the FIM grants power to the authority to issue some administrative fines within the set law in order to address some of the non-compliance issues. that, for example, if there is a compliance issue that needs to be addressed, the FIM allows the authority to issue a fine to a non-compliant entity. Those are some of the powers, and there are many more powers that are included in there. So in the nutshell, I just give you some few examples from the FIM.
Thank you very much for those examples, Mr. Matomola. Now, of course, this act will have an impact on various industries. Do you foresee this impacting the pension industry, and how so?
The FIM will impact the entire non-banking sector. You will agree with me that the financial sector is ever evolving.
Yes.
And therefore the laws that we have are quite very old. Some are laws that were promulgated in the 1956. So things has moved on. And therefore the manner in which the business has been done in terms of the current laws, it's somehow not in keeping with the innovation that has happened in the financial sector. And therefore, the new legislative instruments will definitely impact the entire non-banking sector, including the pension fund sector, which means the FIM will foster risk-based approach of supervision. When you look at this approach, also it assists the authority in such a way that with its given limited resources, it can direct its resources to risks that are much greater in the financial sector, as opposed to compliance-based, where we look at each and every item in the financial sector, irrespective of the risk that it poses to the financial sector, as well as the issues that if I go specifically to the pension fund sector, you will find that there are certain role players in the pension fund sector that are outside the scope of NAMFISA as we speak currently. These are some of the service providers that provide services to the pension fund industry, like the pension fund administrators. This will be brought into the regulatory net, and therefore they will be regulated to enhance consumer protection, to enhance standards of operations for these particular service providers. So these are some of the changes that will be brought in for the benefit of the consumers, that unregulated intermediaries will also be regulated to ensure consumer protection. So that is, in the nutshell, how the industry will be impacted.
Very well, sir. Now, once this act is gazetted, NAMFISA will embark on industry-wide consultations on standards to be adopted in line with this legislation. Talk to us about these standards.
As I mentioned earlier, that the FIM is a principle-based law. And to operationalize it, we need some subordinate legislation. And therefore, in the FIM, you'll find that the FIM provides that for a given particular scenario, if I may use that word for lack of better word, a subordinate legislation may be issued. And in this respect, that we have identified all critical standards or subordinate measures that need to be issued either by NAMFISA or to be issued by the Minister of Finance. And this has been drafted and has been consulted informally with the industry. However, the law now, which has been signed by His Excellency, requires us that we do a formal consultation on these subordinate measures by firstly gazetting them for public input, so which means everyone will then put comment on them, and those comments will take into consideration before we issue the final subordinate legislation for implementation. And these standards ranges from prudential matters, market conduct matters, the registration forms and statutory filing, which are the returns that the regulated entities will be submitting to the authority for the purposes of supervision and surveillance. So it's a number of standards that will be put out there, which covers across prudential matters, market conduct matters, registration, and the returns that need to be submitted to the authority for ongoing supervision and surveillance of the industry.
Now, what is the time frame for industry stakeholders to be fully compliant after this is gazetted?
We have taken in consideration, given the magnitude of the changes that are envisaged in the FIM, and it is our expectation that once the law is gazetted, we will go through a process where we will have industry consultation, where we will have consultation with stakeholders and our public awareness initiatives so that we can address all the issues that is required. And we are looking at around 9 to 12 months after gazetting that the industry should comply with the new legislative instrument. However, we are mindful that with any changes, there are teething problems that may occur. As such, I urge for cooperation and collaboration with all the stakeholders that we can address all these unforeseen teething problems in a very short and possible time that we can do so, that we can have an industry that is modernized and can serve the Namibian public.
Mr. Matomola, please talk to us about the main provisions of the NAMFISA bill, which was signed by President Hage Geingob earlier in the year.
The NAMFISA Act, if you look at it, it is part and parcel of this reform that we undertaken. To be specific with the NAMFISA Act, it is an establishing act for the authorities. Therefore, it addresses the issues of the functions and objectives of NAMFISA. It incorporates the best practices that pertain to a supervisory body like NAMFISA. And it gives powers to NAMFISA, as well as it also allows NAMFISA to cooperate and collaborate with other regulators in the world or in the region as well. And it addresses issues of governance of NAMFISA. So if you look at that, for lack of better word, I may say that this NAMFISA Act is more inward-looking of NAMFISA in terms of how NAMFISA need to operate, what are its powers and functions, how it needs to be governed, and in terms of the supervisory approaches that it may take. So in the nutshell, that's what it addresses. And it also addresses issues like what are the remedial actions that those who are aggrieved by the decisions of NAMFISA, how can they get redress? All those are addressed in the new NAMFISA Act.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Now, as we conclude, please share with us your final remarks.
My final remarks, I'm excited that we can now finally see that the reforms in the legislative instrument has seen its light. It has been signed off. It has been coming for a long period of time. And therefore, this will definitely foster financial stability and competitiveness of the financial sector in Namibia. And I urge all the role players to embrace these reforms for the better Namibia and as for the better financial sector that can serve the entire Namibian public. And the authority will consult with an open mind to take the peculiarity of Namibia, as well as to make sure that Namibia is competitive, to make sure that the financial sector is safeguarded, the risks are mitigated, that we have a robust financial system. So I urge everyone to embrace these changes so that we can move forward.
All right. Well, Mr. Matomola, we appreciate you for taking our time to speak to us this morning.